Good afternoon and welcome to the City Club of Cleveland. I'm Hugh McKay, President of the Board of Directors of the City Club. The television series Biography named Johann Gutenberg, the inventor of the movable type, as the single most influential person of the last 1,000 years. Today's speaker, Charles M. Geschke, Chairman of the Board and co-founder of Adobe Systems, has been called a latter-day Gutenberg and the Gutenberg of digital type. Dr. Geschke is a native Clevelander. His father was a photo engraver, and the die or the type was cast for Chuck Geschke at an early age. As a child, Chuck would visit his father at work, and he watched his dad working with cyanide and other toxic chemicals in the process of etching printing plates. Chuck Geschke knew there had to be a better way. His father's advice was, don't go into the printing business. Luckily for Apple, Microsoft, and much of our modern technology, Dr. Geschke did not take that advice. Dr. Geschke and the Adobe Systems co-founder John Warnock's Interpress language evolved into Adobe's PostScript, which directly led to the first desktop publishing system where anyone could set type, compose documents, and print them as they appeared on the screen electronically. We take all this for granted now, but what Dr. Geschke and Adobe started was revolutionary and created an entire industry. With the recent passing of the legendary Steve Jobs, it is noteworthy that Jobs' early licensing agreement with Adobe was crucial to Apple establishing itself. Adobe was key to the success of countless other businesses, as well as becoming part of the everyday life of millions of us around the world. Dr. Geschke is truly a technology pioneer and a legend. Dr. Geschke is a recipient of the John W. Gardner Leadership Award, the Entrepreneur of the Year Award, the Medal of Achievement from the American Electronics Association, and in 2008, President Obama presented him with the National Medal of Technology. Dr. Geschke serves on boards of numerous educational institutions, arts, and nonprofit organizations. He holds a doctorate in computer science from Carnegie Mellon University, as well as a master's degree and BA from Xavier University. And some here today would say Dr. Geschke's biggest claim to fame is he attended St. Ignatius High School here in Cleveland. He also taught at John Carroll in the 60s, and his wife Nan, who is with us here today, went to Magnificat. Dr. Geschke continues to actively work, as he says, to, quote, make the world a more interesting and creative place. Please welcome to the City Club of Cleveland, Dr. Charles M. Geschke.
Well, thank you, Jim, for that extremely kind invitation, and I actually want to thank someone who's not here today as well, my former colleague at John Carroll in the Math Department, Bob Colasar, who started the ball rolling to get me invited to spend some time with you all at the City Club. As you heard, I'm a Clevelander, so it's always a treat to be back, and Nan and I have spent some time at both St. Ignatius and Magnificat over the last couple of days. I also have a historical link to the City Club, very indirect. But during the 1930s, during the Depression, my mother was a secretary for Judge Carl Friedland, who was at the time the president of the City Club, and who, along with Joe Newman, used to write the annual review every year. And my mother used to tell me how she used to type up the scripts for that program as well. So very indirect, but a link. What I'd like to do today is spend some time telling you some stories about how certain events happened along the way to create the electronics and computer industry that we're all familiar with today. But some of these stories you may not have been as aware of. I'll start with the founding of Silicon Valley, talk about the research, educational, and government funding environment that was around to make the whole industry possible. I'll talk a little bit about my time at Xerox PARC because it was such a seminal foundation point for the personal computer. A few words about Adobe that my partner and I founded, and I'll end with talking about some of the things that keep me up at night having to do with technology and science and research. Santa Clara Valley is a valley. Sometimes valleys aren't valleys. And it was actually a very bucolic place in the 19th century and early 20th century, full of orchards, apricots, prunes, walnuts, almonds, and so forth. But early in the 20th century, there was a variety of research and electronic activities starting to go on there in radio, television, and primarily in military electronics. And a lot of it started because of Stanford University and UC Berkeley, which was across the bay, and the affiliates that built themselves around those two universities, as well as their graduates. By 1951, a man by the name of Fred Terman became the Dean of Engineering at Stanford and the university provost. And most people recognize him as the father of Silicon Valley, because his idea was that he wanted to encourage faculty and graduates to start their own companies, but to base them near Stanford and form a sort of symbolic relationship with that university. Well, it turns out Stanford, among many other things, had an incredible amount of land that was associated with its initial endowment from Leland Stanford. And so he, with the concurrence of the Board of Trustees at the university, started what he called Stanford Industrial Park. And Varian, Hewlett-Packard, Lockheed, and eventually Xerox PARC all based themselves within Stanford Industrial Park, along with a number of other biotechnology companies and others that have followed later. And if you think about the history of Silicon Valley, it was sort of a unique confluence of ingredients that led to a technology revolution. There were the two universities, Stanford and UC Berkeley. There was some groundbreaking research going on in the area of primarily electronics in the early days. And engineers and scientists were drawn not only from those universities, but from all over the world to come and join in this activity. And around the technical and research activities, law firms grew up whose job it was to provide intellectual property protection and work on the financing of new companies, and venture capital was really started in that area, particularly strong in the San Francisco area, in the Bay Area. And finally, the ingredient I think you may find most interesting is there was significant funding by the U.S. government as part of the Department of Defense. And today we see lots of debate and concern about whether government can do anything well. And I think after I tell you a little bit about government's involvement in getting the computing and electronics industry started, you'll understand that sometimes government can do something extremely well, and they did in this case. The story of the government's involvement starts with an organization called the Advanced Research Projects Agency, which was part of the Defense Department. And it was created right after Sputnik, as so many technology investments were. And after its formation, some of the people who were involved in it came to Eisenhower and said, you cannot continue to grow a worldwide military presence by relying on analog communications. You're going to have to go and figure out how to do digital communications. Now, I suspect Eisenhower had no idea what that man said, but he was smart enough to really respect him. And as he was handing the government over to Kennedy, he told him the same thing. He said, I've been given this advice. I really think you need to pay attention to it. Well, Kennedy, in turn, took his most technically savvy cabinet member, Robert McNamara, and also the cabinet member with the largest budget, and said, I want you to figure out what to do. He said, okay. And he had a friend at MIT whose name was J.C.R. Licklider. Now, Licklider was not an electronics engineer and didn't really know much directly about computing. His field of excellence was in psychoacoustics. But nonetheless, he had been hanging out at the Media Lab at MIT long enough to realize that they were doing research in using computers to communicate, not to calculate. And if you think back to that time period, you remember IBM advertising about how many multiplies they could do in a microsecond. Well, MIT was taking a very different point of view. They weren't interested in doing calculations. They were interested in communicating. So he hired Licklider to start this project. And Licklider himself had written a paper in 1962 at a industrial research group back in Boston called Bolt, Beranek, and Newman. And the title, very humbly, was Intergalactic Computer Network. So he really thought big, and he was very interested in computer communication and networking. Well, Licklider decided he was going to do this a little differently than the way the government usually invested in research. You probably are aware of the National Science Foundation. It tends to give lots of relatively small grants to huge numbers of people all around the country. Licklider decided that wasn't the way you could spawn off a brand new research program, and so he decided he would give a budget of 30 to 40 times at least what those NSF grants were, but he would only give them to a small number, relatively a dozen or so institutions, identified by the people who led those institutions. He called them principal investigators. His decision was he would not micromanage these people because he both trusted them and knew that they knew a lot more about what they were needed to do to evolve this industry than the government did, or certainly JCR knew. He also wanted them to be very sure to share their research, not to keep it private to themselves, but to share it horizontally among the entire organization and install programs of regular exchanges of ideas. And so he launched this by picking out a few industrial labs, the RAND Corporation in Santa Monica, Lincoln Labs in Bolt, Beranek, and Newman back in the Boston area, and Stanford Research Institute, not directly related to Stanford University, but located in Menlo Park, California. And then he picked a bunch of universities: Carnegie Tech, Harvard, MIT, Caltech, Stanford, Berkeley, UCLA, the University of Illinois, the University of Michigan, University of Utah, and probably a couple others that I, at the moment, don't remember. He got them all going. He said, your job is to do two things. You have to do enough research that if Congress ever calls into question what we've done here, we can justify it. But the most important task you have is to build a whole new cadre of people who have expertise in all aspects of electronics and computing and networking technology. Well, a man, eventually Licklider decided to move on and do something else, and he recruited a man called Bob Taylor in 1966 to take over ARPA. And Bob's background was also in psychoacoustics. He was not an engineer or electronics engineer. And Bob, in turn, found a fellow at Lincoln Labs in the Boston area. His name was Larry Roberts, and he was doing research into networking using packet switching. And he said, okay, I'm going to give you a grant to start a computer network that hooks together all of these ARPA institutions, both universities and labs. And Larry, in turn, then created what was called the ARPANET in the late 60s, and it's the precursor of the Internet. So very early on, more than almost 30 years before the Internet took off. Well, it turned out that eventually Taylor decided to turn over the ARPA unit to Roberts, and he moved on to take a job with Xerox Corporation in Palo Alto. Now, the reason I've given you that story is not only to show that government could do something very well with the right kind of leadership, but it's also the way that I and essentially every senior executive and engineer in Silicon Valley who got an advanced degree was educated. We all referred to ourselves as ARPA brats. And we would go to meetings during graduate school to meet other people, and as our careers evolved, it formed a network of researchers and eventually business people who made the industry vital and alive. I got my degree at Carnegie Mellon in 1972, and I had an opportunity to take a job at the Xerox Research Center in Palo Alto. Now, Xerox at that time period, in the late 60s and early 70s, was a rocket ship of a company, doing incredibly well. They brought the copier out in the early 60s. It was a dynamite product. They were a multi-billion-dollar company. It seemed like it could only continue to grow and prosper. However, their executive leadership, Peter McCullough and David Kearns, knew that they were essentially a single technology, roughly speaking, a single product company. And they knew in the long run that that would make them vulnerable because someone would be able to undercut them either technically and or with differentiated pricing. And so they needed to diversify. But they also instinctively knew that if they tried to diversify in Rochester, New York, where they were headquartered, all the antibodies who worked on the copiers would kill off anything new before it ever got anywhere. So they decided to hire a physicist out of Washington University in St. Louis. His name is George Pake. And they gave him the job of figuring out where to locate a brand new research facility that would be completely divorced from the copier research that went inside the corporation. And George knew about Stanford and Fred Terman, and so he picked the Stanford Industrial Park as the place to locate this research center and gave it a fairly significant budget. But the key decision he made was he hired two people to start the computing research program at Xerox PARC, Bob Taylor, who had just left ARPA, and a man by the name of Jerry Elkine, who came out of Bolt, Beranek, and Newman. And the reason that those were great decisions in terms of hiring new leadership is they knew where all the ARPA people were. And they hired us and put a large number of us in those early days into the lab at Xerox PARC. So it was sort of like having the best and the brightest of new technology all working in the same organization under the same conditions. By 1976, in my office, I had a personal computer called the Alto. It had a mouse. It had software on it that looked remarkably like Microsoft Word because the young man who did that software eventually left. His name was Charles Simone, and he went to Microsoft and built Office for them. It had an electronic mail program. It was hooked up to the Ethernet, which was invented by Bob Metcalf, who later founded 3Com, and he was in the office next to me at Xerox. We had laser printers, 60-page-a-minute black and white, 10-page-a-minute full-color printers. We had file servers, and we were sort of minor research group on the ARPANET, so we had ARPANET activity and access so we could send mail to everyone in that research community. This is 1976, 5 years before the introduction of the IBM PC. The following year, I was given a job to put on a demonstration for Xerox senior management of what the office of the future could look like with a couple of other colleagues. Xerox roughly every 2 years would have a meeting of their top 250 worldwide management team, bring them all to one location. It was mostly business but partly social, so they brought their wives and their girlfriends with them as well. And I say wives and girlfriends because I believe every one of the people who came to this particular one was male. Think about that, ladies. So in Boca Raton, Florida, we set up a morning stage demonstration that showed vignettes of what the Office of the Future could look like. And then in the afternoon, we put together a trade show so that the Xerox executives and their spouses could come in, play with the equipment, talk to the researchers, get a feeling for what the Office of the Future would feel like. Essentially, every Xerox executive who came into the trade show went like this. Now, if you know anything about sales, this is not good body language, okay? This is somebody who's scared at what he's looking at, afraid of it, and he just hopes if he holds his breath for a few minutes, it'll go away. Their wives loved it. They sat down, they played with the mouse, they typed in a page, they looked at it on the screen, they hit a button, it printed, it looked the same on the printed page as it did on the screen. They said, wow, this is incredible. Now, they were the eventual customers, but their husbands in their infinite wisdom didn't want to have to deal with this. So that was my first hint that we had a major problem that we were going to have to deal with. in terms of getting all of the technology that we developed at Xerox out into the real world. Well, when I returned from this project, I was given the opportunity to start a new laboratory. And the first thing I needed to do was hire a chief scientist. I knew this man named John Warnock by reputation, and our lab was going to work in graphics and electronic printing, and I knew he had the expertise to be a lead researcher in that area. So I took him out to lunch. He had a beard, and I had a beard. He had 3 kids, 2 boys and a girl. I had 3 kids, 2 boys and a girl. We were still married to the same woman we married originally. He was a mathematician, but most importantly, he was also a soccer referee, as was I. So we hired him. Best hiring decision I ever made in my life. And we went to work on a variety of different research projects, but one of the ones we were asked to look into was to develop a protocol that would allow you to take any kind of computer and software running on that computer and hook up to any laser printer of different characteristics and print the identical page on each one of those printers. The project was called Interpress. We got it to the point where we could show it to Xerox senior management. They loved it. They said, we want to adopt this. We want this to be the Xerox standard for printing. Well, John and I were pretty excited because we'd only had our lab open for a couple of years. Here we had this big breakthrough, this major corporation. It was great. I got on an airplane. I flew back to Stamford, Connecticut, where Xerox was headquartered, and I said, I want to start talking about a marketing program and a budget to market this technology. And they said, oh, wait a minute. Wait a minute. You can't talk about this in public. I said, really? Yeah. They said, it takes 7 years to bring out a product at Xerox. I said, 7 years? It'll be so old by the time it comes out, it'll be useless. That's 2 to 3 generations at least in the technology world. No, sorry, 7 years. So I went back to California. John and I sat down in my office and we said, well, we're either going to get old and gray and just keep developing things that never see the light of day, or we can leave and start our own business and see if we can do this out in the real world. You know what we did. We left. We were introduced to a man by the name of Bill Hambrick, who was one of the very first significant venture capitalists in the Bay Area, focused primarily on investing in technology companies. We described to him our idea, and our idea was that we were going to build and manufacture computers, laser printers, plate making equipment, and all of the software necessary to operate all of this, and sell it into the Fortune 500 so they could do in-house publishing. Bill liked the idea because he hated financial printers, because he said they ripped him off all the time. We didn't care what motivated Bill, as long as he was willing to invest in us. He said, well, have you ever run a business before? And we said, well, no, not exactly. He said, fine, I'll hire someone to help you write a business plan for your idea, and then I'll raise the money. You quit your jobs, start the company. So we did. We raised $2.5 million to be paid over 2 years, and we opened our doors and went to work. Not too long after that, a professor of mine who had been at Carnegie Mellon, Gordon Bell, who by then was working for Digital Equipment and ran their research and development, came by to see what we were doing. He said, wow, that actually is very interesting to me. He said, but I don't need computers, I'm Digital Equipment. And I've got to deal with Ricoh in Japan for printers. I don't need the printers. But I have 2 or 3 development teams trying to build the software to marry the two together, and they're getting nowhere. Why don't you sell me that software? And John and I said, well, we have this business plan, Gordon, and we really need to do that because it raised $2.5 million. He said, well, if you change your mind, call me. About a month and a half later, a friend of ours who had gone to work left Xerox and gone to work for Apple brought Steve Jobs over. Very similar reaction. I said, wow, that's really cool stuff. He said, but I don't need computers. I've got this Macintosh that's coming out in another year, and I've got a deal with Canon for laser printers, so I don't need those. How about selling the company to me and coming to work for Apple? And we said, no, Steve, we really want to start our own business. He said, well, okay, I can sort of understand that. Why don't you sell me the software? And we said, well, Steve, we have this business plan. It raised $2.5 million, and that's what we need to do. And he said, well, I think you're nuts. Steve was always very cautious in the language that he used. So John and I went and talked to the fellow who was put in by Bill Hambrick as the chairman of our board, and he said, well, Jobs is right, you're nuts. He said, that business plan, throw it out. It was only there to raise the money. Now your customers are telling you what your business should be. Go off and do it. So I got on the phone, I called up Steve, and I said, Steve, we'd like to sell you the software. He said, well, what do you want for the company? I said, Steve, the company's not for sale. Okay, we'll do a deal. So by the end of our first year in business, in December of 1983, we signed a deal with Apple in which they prepaid a significant amount of future royalties because they would pay us a royalty on every laser writer that shipped. And Steve bought 19.9% of the company at 5x the money that the investors put in 1 year earlier. This never happens in Silicon Valley. We were profitable at the end of our first year. So when people ask me, well, what's it like to start a company in Silicon Valley? I said, I'm happy to share it with you, but you should not assume that it will be your experience if you start a company, because this just does not happen. In 1985, the laser writer was launched. The Macintosh was launched in 1984. It got incredible critical acclaim because it was the first time you had a private printing press that you could drive with software from a small desktop machine. Unfortunately, at the time, Apple was trying to compete with IBM, and their marketing program was called the Macintosh Office, and they were getting nowhere because IBM had way too many feet on the street. And so as a result, things were getting tight, and as you may remember, Steve was asked to leave Apple at that time, which we weren't very happy with. But a young marketing guy, John Scull, from Apple, got us at Adobe and a company up in Seattle called Aldus, which did PageMaker, and got the three companies together and said, what can we do to launch a marketing program to turn this around? And that's where the concept of desktop publishing came from. And within a matter of months, Apple and we were having a tremendously successful ramp-up of revenue and profitability. In fact, our revenue went from $4 million to 16 to 39 to 83 to 129 million the first 5 years. We had several public stock splits. We went public in August of 1986. We raised a whopping $5.5 million. Think about Facebook and all those other things. And after our offering, we had a market cap of $55 million. Bill Hambrick told us, you don't need the cash. Go out at a very aggressive price and let everybody, including all the shareholders, write it up. They did, and they loved the company for that. Today we have almost 10,000 employees all over the world. We're at a run rate of $4 billion a year, and our market cap, ironically, is larger than Xerox's. What keeps me up at night? Actually, I sleep pretty well most of the time, but sometimes I don't sleep quite as well. And the first thing that troubles me is I look around our country now and I see a dramatically vanishing pool of U.S.-born engineers and scientists. And that's troubling to me. My thesis advisor at Carnegie Mellon was a man by the name of Bill Wolfe, and he eventually became the president of the National Academy of Engineering, and he did some testimony before Congress in the middle of the last decade, around 2005, and he talked about some alarming statistics. For example, and I'm not going to give you all of them, there are way too many, but 45% of the PhD physicists and over 55% of the engineers in the United States in 2005 were born outside our country. 25% back then, and I know today it's much larger, of the engineering faculty members at U.S. universities were born outside the United States. And between 1990 and 2004, over 1/3 of the Nobel Prizes awarded for scientific work performed in the United States were awarded to scientists who were born outside the United States. I think we all recognize that having a large share of the world's scientists and engineers is crucial to nation's ability to innovate? Well, the National Bureau of Economic Research tells us that China is now producing more scientists and engineers with doctorates than the United States. And I want to be clear, the problem isn't immigration. In fact, thank God those foreign-born engineers and scientists have come to our country. But unfortunately, over the last 10 years, we've made it harder and harder for them to stay. Post 9/11, it's very hard for some of them to get green cards and visas. And the other thing that's changing is, in particular in places like India and China, their economies are starting to thrive. Things aren't so bad. They can get venture capital. They can start a business back home. And a lot of them are doing that. And that will have a dramatically negative impact on the economy here in the United States, especially in areas that require science and engineering. The other thing is how much we are investing as a country into research, in particular peer research. Well, if you look at the statistics in 2007, in global spending on R&D, the United States leads the world, 34%. And if you add Japan to the United States, it's 50%. What's wrong? That sounds good. Well, the real way I think to think about this is as a percent of the economy in these countries. Well, now if we look at the U.S. as a percent of its economy and how much it's investing, all of a sudden we're 7th. We trail Sweden, Finland, Japan, Switzerland, Iceland, and South America. And the American Association for the Advancement of Science points out that both China and North Korea are investing from government 10% or more annually, increasing 10% or more annually the amount of investment that they're making in pure research. And in fact, if we look just at basic research, take the D out of R&D, we actually rank 11th as a percent of the economy. And then if we remove military research, we rank 22nd. So much for being number 1. And that's scary. That means that we are not investing in what's necessary for us to thrive in the long run. Now, the other thing, one of my other hobby horses, is that a lot of our best and brightest students, in fact, don't go into science and engineering. They go to Wall Street, and that's a problem as well. But I will tell you that business will not, and the private sector are not going to pick up the slack in basic research for the country. And the last thing that should keep me up at night, and sometimes does, is 2 guys in a garage that I have never heard of, because they could do something to completely disrupt my company. Thank you very much. I appreciate your time.
Good job. Today at the City Club of Cleveland, we're listening to a Friday Forum featuring Dr. Charles M. Geschke, Chairman of the Board and co-founder of Adobe Systems, Inc. We will return to our speaker in a minute for the traditional City Club question and answer period. We encourage you to formulate your questions now. Please remember to keep them brief. We remind you that members and guests alike are welcome to attend City Club forums, and we hope everybody listening who's not already a member will join the City Club. We welcome all of you here today and those listening to WCPN 90.3 FM, WCLV, WTAM, or one of the many radio stations across the country. Our television broadcast partner is WVIZ PBS Idea Stream. Television broadcasts of the City Club are made possible by Cleveland State University and PNC. Our live webcast is supported by the University of Akron. We're pleased to welcome guests at tables hosted by One Community and St. Ignatius High School. Thank you for joining us today. We're also pleased to welcome students who are here as part of the City Club student program. Participation of these students is made possible by a generous grant from the Jeffrey David Epstein Memorial Student Fund. With us today are students from the Young Scholars Program, Max Hayes High School, Magnificat High School, and Shaw High School. Will the students please stand and be recognized? Now we'd like to return to our speaker for our traditional City Club question and answer period. We welcome questions from everyone, including guests. Holding the microphone today is City Club 100th Anniversary Assistant Director Betsy Wallace and Special Initiatives Coordinator Phil Williams. First question, please.
Dr. Geschke, welcome back to Cleveland. It was a very interesting presentation. I'd like to know from your background as an entrepreneur and leader in Silicon Valley what you think other regions, i.e. Cleveland, Northeast Ohio, should be doing to stimulate similar growth in an industry of their choice in the next 20 years, let's say.
Well, the reason I used Silicon Valley to illustrate the points that I wanted to make is it's sort of my life, the life I lived. It doesn't mean there isn't interesting and exciting things going out in other parts of the country. Certainly Research Triangle Park in North Carolina, the area around Austin, Texas, the Boston area, and Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and certainly with the resources of the Cleveland Clinic, University Hospital, as well as Case Western Reserve, and you've got the nucleus for an environment here in which you could begin to develop very strong entrepreneurial programs. It takes a sort of symbiotic relationship between the universities and the faculty and students associated with those universities, as well as the venture capital community, to be able to make that happen. Access to venture funds varies a lot with the economy, but in fact they're almost always available if you know the right person to ask. So I think you have the ingredients here in Cleveland of being able to do some rather remarkable things. They may not be in electronics and computing, they may be in biotechnology or some of the green sciences, but clearly you have the capacity and the institutions here to be able to start something like that. I hope you do.
Dr. Geschke, in speaking about the Silicon Valley, you point out the very important role it has played. And last Sunday's New York Times had a very interesting article about a new school in the Silicon Valley, one of many throughout the country, actually. But this particular school feels that young people are not getting the opportunity to learn their basic arithmetic, to use their books accordingly because of computers. They're depending upon computers, the various buttons to push and give them the answers. As a result, they don't have any computers at all in the school through the first 8 years of the school. And then they begin to use computers. That's rather a throwback to the old days. And I wonder how you feel about that, particularly in view of the very important role that you played in developing the sophisticated computers you described today.
Well, that's a great question. I believe those are called the Waldorf schools, and they are, in fact, as you indicate, around the country. And I think it's an interesting point of view. People have done a fair amount of research on the amount of time that young people spend either in front of the television or playing with devices or tweeting their friends and going up on Facebook and so forth. And those, in fact, are all significant distractions for young people. But in the learning process, my feeling is a balance that makes much more sense. You're right. If you want to multiply two large numbers, you're probably going to type them into an iPad or something and have the machine do the work. And clearly that would be an issue if you could never do it manually and by hand. But in the world in which these children are going to live, they have to balance the difference between the expectations of what they can do creatively and the resources that they have available to use to do that. And so I'm a little skeptical about going that far back to removing all kinds of technology in the process of education. But certainly core sciences, in fact, I've always told people who are interested in getting into the computing and electronics industry that they better spend their time taking a lot of mathematics and a lot of physics and chemistry as undergraduates and not worry so much about the computing courses. because it's the core sciences that let you really move ahead when you get on into your career.
You mentioned a lot of names during your presentation, but I didn't hear Al Gore. Did he or did he not have a role to play in the development of the Internet?
Oh, I'll let that to Al to defend. The Internet was actually developed outside the United States at the CERN Research Center in Switzerland initially. And a lot of the ingredients that allowed that Internet to be developed were, as I described, done back in the early 60s with packet switching, the AloaNet, done in Hawaii by Bob Metcalf, the young man who invented the Ethernet. And so Al was certainly supportive of science and technology, but I think invention may be too strong a word.
You mentioned a lot of changes of personnel in your career. Were any of those inhibited by the non-compete contracts?
Let me ask a clarification question. You say, I didn't understand the first part of your question, the preface of it.
Well, you're here yourself. When you left your company and then formed a new company, were you inhibited by non-compete contracts?
So the question is, are non-compete clauses causing it difficult to be able to hire people and bring them into companies? Most of the non-compete clauses are focused primarily around business strategies and business plans. Most companies today protect their intellectual property by a combination of patents, some trade secrets, which are like non-compete clauses, and other ways to protect that. But I must admit that, at least in our experience, we can find people who are talented and don't find themselves, we tend not to hire from companies that are directly competitive of us, partly because we already know those. We know that they know that business. We want people who come in who can start new businesses and take us in new directions. So we haven't found the non-compete to be a barrier to hiring great people. The hardest thing is getting them to get degrees, get out of college, and be available to us. We now have almost 1,500 engineers in India, and I never would have thought that, but that's where we can find the talent. That's where we go. Yes?
In his recent biography, Steve Jobs is quoted as saying he was always interested in the humanities as a kid, but he also liked computers. And then he came across someone who said, the successful person is someone who can stand at the intersection of the humanities and science. I know you have some background in the humanities in your education, and I was wondering, how did it influence you, and how do you view that?
All right. So my undergraduate major in college was Latin. Somewhat unusual in Silicon Valley. I'm not aware of any other senior executives who have that particular undergraduate degree. But I was lucky in that I was advised early on, actually at St. Ignatius High School, I must admit, to spend as much of my effort as possible on the liberal arts, in addition to whatever else I was interested in. And the reason was that that stayed with you through your entire life. It really didn't matter what you did for a career or a job or a vocation. If you had the ability to express yourself in writing, to give a good talk, a speech, the ability to sell your ideas to other people was critical no matter what you did. And so I have always advised young people, if they ask me, to take as many liberal arts courses as they can, particularly in their undergraduate years, and take pure sciences, physics, chemistry, biology, and let the rest of the things happen as they get into graduate school. So I feel very strongly about that.
Thank you. I enjoyed your talk greatly today.
Thank you.
Many years ago, when I graduated from high school, went to college, had a friend who went to the Air Force. I saw him when I graduated, and he told me about email. First person to tell me about emails in the Air Force. How, if you can tell us, how are they communicating now in the military? What's next on the horizon?
Well, it's interesting. I'll tell you an interesting story. It's not a global answer to your question, but it's an episodic one that I think is quite interesting. I serve on a nonprofit board, and one of the board members is a Army general who actually, until very recently, was commanding a set of troops in Iraq. And when we first met, he walked up to me and he said, "I want to shake your hand." He said, "I got to tell you a story." He said, "I was having severe problems in Iraq because when I would try to hold staff meetings, people had to get in their Humvees and drive to some common location. And that was the most dangerous part of their day because of IEDs and road bombs and all the terrible things that go on in that part of the world." He said, "I discovered Adobe Connect, which is a peer-to-peer communications product that lets you not only see people's faces, so you're like you're in a meeting, but also share documents and a variety of other things. And it's an industrial product that we have." And he said, "I decided to start using it." And he said, "All of a sudden, for all of my staff meetings, we never have to travel. We do it all electronically." And so I think that's a good example of what can happen when technology matures to the point and people like he have the leadership ability to understand how to use it. And it made a real difference in his command over in Iraq.
Yes, thank you for a really wonderful, mind-expanding talk. Appreciate it. You mentioned earlier in your talk the importance of ARPA and government funding and being the catalyst to starting a lot of grand research. My question would be, does ARPA, et cetera, still exist today? Is it viable? And what kind of threats do you see with the budget constraints that are going on today for government funding in research?
Okay, well, that's a great question. ARPA doesn't exist, but DARPA does. It changed its name from the Advanced Research Project Agency to the Defense Research Project Agency. And DARPA today has unfortunately lost a lot of the philosophy that Licklider tried to instill. It now, in fact, very much micromanages the projects that it does. Almost all of them are defense-related. They typically have no direct relationship to either pure research or something that has direct applicability to the commercial world. So it's very different. In terms of the amount of research going on, I gave you some data there. There's a lot more that you can find on the web. But the truth is that we as a country, at the government, the national level, have severely curtailed investment in research. And the assumption is the private sector will pick it up. But unfortunately, the private sector has a responsibility to its shareholders, and so it tends to do research and development only in areas that they have immediate applicability to revenue with new products and new solutions. So I think it's a big problem, and there is nothing like ARPA around today. Now, there are the National Institutes of Health, but even they have some difficulties in raising enough funding. And I think we have to decide as a population whether we want that investment to happen. And if we do, then we have to cast our ballots for people who agree with us.
Well, also, thank you very much, sir. And in addition to the concerns which you just answered with the last question, I think there's a great concern about the lack of interest in the sciences, which is so evident today in our schools and universities. And I'm wondering if you have any things that you have seen work, programs that are effective, especially at the K-12 level, where we know, the interest in science really must begin, so that we can correct and this problem, which is endemic throughout the United States, of diminishing numbers of engineers and scientists.
Right. He probably would not be, or will not be happy with me if he sees this recording of this talk, but our oldest son is a high school chemistry and physics teacher. He happens to teach in an area in California, in Fremont, California, that's populated mostly by Indian and Asian families and students. There's a history of those cultures being very strong in their children getting good education. And my son has been able, in fact, to work with the physics group, and they just this past year went back to Washington for a nationwide competition, and this one high school in the middle of Northern California came in 9th in the country. So you can imagine how proud I am of my son, but that's not my point. My point is that most regions in the country are not in a position where they promote science and engineering, and many of our families don't promote it either. And what we need to do is build a sort of wall of heroes in science and engineering that are role models for people to want to aspire to, and particularly young people. And we do that in sports, and we do that in music to a certain extent, but we don't do it much in science and engineering. I don't know how to make that happen, by the way. I don't have an answer, but we need to do that, because without seeing those role models and understanding why it could be so exciting, young people won't be motivated to do that. And if it's money, that's not a motivator in science and engineering. The reason an engineer invests his energy to build something is in the hope, usually not fulfilled, but in the hope that millions of people will use what you've done. And that's what motivates an engineer and a scientist.
A related question is how about once they get to the level of college or graduate school, are there things that we should be doing now that we aren't doing in terms of trying to support students at that level to encourage them to develop and then maybe move into the entrepreneurial businesses that were so important for you in your career?
Well, I think even there, it's the vocational counseling. You know, I look at a lot of some of my children's friends, extremely bright young people, and a lot of them decide to go into finance and Wall Street. And that's interesting, but it doesn't bring our country forward, okay? You're just figuring out ways to make money off money. You're not building something, you're not inventing something, you're not providing a new solution or a cure, you're just creating wealth. And in the long run, unfortunately, that's not the answer. So we really need to think about the role models and the ambitions that we put in front of our young people and get them to understand what they can do if they take their raw native intelligence and apply it in an area where they can be creative and create something new and exciting and interesting and worthwhile to mankind.
My name is Terry Caslow. I'm a junior at Shaw High School. And my question is there still a gender gap in technology research? And if yes, what would you suggest to fix that?
Okay. So the question is there a gender bias in technology? I think that was the question. And I think there may have been the hint of, is there a hiring bias in that regard? Well, you know, it's interesting. When my partner and I started a company, the first thing we said to one another is we wanted to build a company that we would like to work at. Because we figured if we did that, then we could recruit some really good people. So that was idea number one. As we started to do it, we kept trying and did hire people who were smarter than we are. And that's become part of our hiring philosophy at Adobe. I tell every manager, hire people who are smarter than you are. It's a much bigger population from which to choose. Now you're all paying attention. And, you know, if they do your job better than you, the only alternative is for you to get promoted. So that's a great way to do it. And our philosophy is we hire everybody, male, female. We don't care about what your cultural background, your racial background, your ethnic background, your lifestyle choices. As long as you're a really bright person who can do a great job for us, we'll hire you. And if you were to walk through the offices of Adobe down in San Jose, you'd sort of think you were in the United Nations, because it sort of looks like that. And I think that's the way to survive in any industry, but in particular in our high technology industry.
Great talk. Today at the City Club of Cleveland, we've been listening to Dr. Charles Geschke, Chairman and co-founder of Adobe Systems, Inc. Thank you, Dr. Geschke. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. This forum is now adjourned.
For information on upcoming speakers or for podcasts of the City Club, go to cityclub.org.